Admiral Sarah Kane stood before the crystalline war council of the Zephyrian Empire, feeling like an ant attempting to negotiate with a forest of glowing trees. The council chamber stretched upward into impossible geometric patterns that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them, all carved from some translucent material that pulsed with soft blue light in rhythm with the planet's twin suns. "Your Majesty," Kane began, her voice echoing strangely in the vast space, "the United Earth Coalition comes before you once again to propose terms for lasting peace between our peoples." Queen Asteria sat upon what could generously be called a throne and more accurately described as a living sculpture that had learned to hold still for royal occasions. Her luminescent silver skin caught the chamber's light like polished metal, and her elongated ears, currently tinged with the deep purple that Kane's briefings had taught her, indicated skepticism and barely contained hostility. Twitched with each word the human admiral spoke. "Admiral Kane," the Queen replied, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions Kane couldn't quite perceive. "In the 3 years since your people began their peaceful expansion into our territory, you have presented 47 different proposals for coexistence. Each has been as inadequate as the last." Kane fought the urge to point out that it was difficult to craft adequate proposals when the other party's definition of adequate appeared to be complete human withdrawal from this entire sector of the galaxy. Instead, she activated her holographic display, showing detailed schematics of the proposed joint colony framework. "This proposal is different," Kane said, gesturing to the three-dimensional images floating between them. "Joint colonies with shared resource management, integrated cultural exchange programs, and most importantly, combined environmental restoration projects for the systems damaged during the conflict." The Zephyrian Council members, 12 beings whose appearance suggested evolution had decided to experiment with making people out of starlight and good intentions, murmured among themselves in their musical language. Kane caught fragments through her universal translator: impossible, naive, and what she suspected was a particularly creative insult involving her species' reproductive habits. Queen Asteria's ears shifted from purple to a deep crimson that Kane's briefings had failed to mention, which was concerning since she'd been assured the cultural guides were comprehensive. "Admiral, your people are destroyers by nature. You arrive in a system and immediately begin reshaping it to suit your needs, with no regard for existing ecosystems or established civilizations. Your Majesty, the Kepler 442 incident was an accident," Kane said, trying to keep her voice level despite having had this conversation in various forms for the past 18 months. "Our mining operations had no knowledge of the breeding grounds. The moment we discovered what had happened, we ceased all operations and began environmental restoration. Ceased operations after destroying the spawning grounds of an entire generation," Queen Asteria corrected, rising from her throne with the fluid grace of someone who had never encountered the concept of awkward movement. "Your accident eliminated 12 species from existence, Admiral. Species that had taken millennia to evolve in perfect harmony with their environment." Kane felt the familiar weight of guilt that accompanied any discussion of the Kepler 442 disaster. The Human Mining Consortium had been following standard protocols when they began extracting rare minerals from what appeared to be uninhabited asteroids. The discovery that the asteroids were actually carefully cultivated breeding habitats for dozens of Zephyrian protected species had come too late to prevent an ecological catastrophe that still haunted Kane's dreams. "We cannot undo what happened at Kepler 442, Kane said quietly. "But we can work together to ensure it never happens again. The joint environmental monitoring system outlined in our proposal would give both species advance warning of potential conflicts." "You speak of monitoring systems and protocols," Queen Asteria said, her ears now cycling through colors Kane was fairly certain weren't in any human diplomatic manual, as if the destruction of irreplaceable life can be prevented through bureaucracy and good intentions. One of the council members, an elderly Zephyrian whose skin glowed with the soft gold light Kane associated with their philosophers, leaned forward to address the Queen in their musical language. The translation came through Kane's earpiece a moment later. "Perhaps we should consider the humans' capacity for learning from their mistakes." Queen Asteria's response was sharp enough that Kane's translator hesitated before providing the translation. "Counselor Thalen, their capacity for learning is exceeded only by their capacity for making new and more creative mistakes. Your Majesty, Kane said, deciding that diplomatic courtesy could only stretch so far before it snapped entirely. My people have been at war for 3 years. We've lost colonies, ships, and thousands of lives. Your people have suffered similar losses. At what point does the desire for justice become simple vengeance? The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop several degrees, and Kane realized she'd crossed a line that existed somewhere beyond the boundaries of normal diplomatic protocol. Queen Asteria's skin shifted from luminescent silver to something that resembled ice formed in the heart of a dying star. Justice, Admiral Kane. You speak of justice while your fleets patrol our borders and your mining operations strip resources from systems that have been under Zephyrian protection for millennia. You seek peace terms that would legitimize your presence in territories you have no right to occupy. Kane's tactical training warred with her diplomatic instructions as she formulated her response. The truth was that humanity needed access to the Zephyrian systems. The rare elements found in this sector were essential for the faster-than-light drives that allowed human civilization to exist across multiple star systems. But acknowledging that need would be equivalent to admitting that human expansion was more important than Zephyrian sovereignty. We seek coexistence, Kane said finally. Both species need resources to survive and grow. Both species have knowledge and capabilities that could benefit the other. The question is whether we find a way to share this region of space, or whether we continue fighting until one side destroys the other. An interesting choice of words, Queen Asteria observed. You frame the options as cooperation or mutual destruction, but there is a third possibility you have not mentioned. Which is complete human withdrawal from Zephyrian space. Your species returns to your core systems, and we continue our existence without the constant threat of accidental ecological disasters. Kane looked around the crystalline chamber, noting the way the other council members watched their queen with expressions that suggested this particular option had been discussed extensively in private sessions. Your Majesty, with respect, that's not a realistic solution. Humanity has invested too much in this expansion to simply abandon it. Our colonies in this sector support millions of people who have nowhere else to go. Then you should have considered that before beginning your expansion into occupied territory, Queen Asteria said, settling back onto her throne with the finality of someone who had made a decision that would not be reconsidered. Before Kane could respond, the chamber's massive doors burst open, and a Zephyrian guard rushed in with the kind of urgent, barely controlled panic that transcended species barriers. The guard's skin flickered rapidly between colors Kane's briefings had identified as indicating extreme stress and fear. Your Majesty, the guard said, dropping to one knee in what Kane recognized as the Zephyrian gesture of emergency protocol, our perimeter scouts have detected a human patrol approaching the capital's outer defensive ring. They appear to be investigating something in Grid Sector 12. Queen Asteria's ears snapped to full crimson, and her skin began cycling through colors that Kane was fairly certain indicated the Zephyrian equivalent of battle readiness. How many ships? A single squad, Your Majesty. But they are operating within our territorial boundaries without authorization. The Queen turned to Kane with an expression that suggested their peace negotiations had just become significantly more complicated. Admiral, it appears your people have decided to negotiate through military pressure rather than diplomatic discussion. Kane felt her stomach drop toward her boots. Your Majesty, I have no knowledge of any authorized patrols in this system. My fleet has strict orders to maintain position at the border unless directly threatened. Then explain why human soldiers are currently approaching our capital while their admiral sits in our council chamber discussing peace, Queen Asteria demanded, rising from her throne with the controlled fury of someone who felt personally betrayed. Kane activated her communication device, hoping her fleet commander would have an explanation that didn't involve the complete collapse of human-Zephyrian relations. Admiral Kane to Fleet Command, requesting immediate status report on all patrol activities in Zephyrian space. The response came back with the crisp efficiency that Kane usually appreciated and now found terrifying. Admiral, Patrol Group 7 reported emergency beacon signals from Grid Sector 12 approximately 2 hours ago. Sergeant Bradley's squad diverted to investigate possible survivors. Kane closed her eyes and mentally prepared herself for what was about to become either a diplomatic disaster or the final spark that would reignite full-scale war between their species. Sergeant Tom Bradley's idea of a routine patrol had just been redefined by the universe's apparent sense of humor. What should have been a simple border reconnaissance had become a rescue operation involving a crashed Zephyrian transport, several tons of twisted metal, and what appeared to be a small child trapped beneath debris that was slowly leaking gases toxic enough to kill a Zephyrian but merely irritating to humans. "Well, this is just perfect," Bradley muttered, scanning the crash site through his tactical visor. "Command sends us to investigate a distress beacon, and we find ourselves playing hero to the enemy's civilians. Sarge," called Private Torres from the wreckage, "I've got survivors over here. Looks like a family transport that got caught in some kind of industrial accident." Bradley moved toward the voice, his boots crunching on crystalline debris that looked like it had been designed by someone who believed transportation should be beautiful as well as functional. The Zephyrian transport had clearly been elegant before it encountered whatever had sent it spiraling into an emergency landing on this uninhabited moon. "How many survivors?" Bradley asked, already calculating evacuation protocols even though helping enemy civilians violated approximately 12 different regulations. 3 adults, all conscious and mobile," Torres reported. "But there's a kid trapped under the main support beam. The adults are too injured to lift it, and the atmospheric readings show some kind of gas leak that's making them sluggish." Bradley approached the trapped child and felt his chest tighten with familiar pain. The little girl couldn't be more than 7 or 8 years old, her luminescent skin flickering weakly as she struggled against the debris pinning her legs. Her large eyes, the distinctive amber color that marked Zephyrian nobility according to his briefings, were filled with fear and confusion as she looked up at the armored human soldiers surrounding her. "Hey there, sweetheart," Bradley said softly, removing his helmet so she could see his face. "My name's Tom. We're going to get you out of there, okay?" The child said something in musical Zephyrian that his translator rendered as, "Are you going to hurt me?" "No, honey," Bradley replied, hoping his translator was working properly. "We're here to help. Can you tell me your name?" "Lyra," the child whispered, her bioluminescent tears creating patterns down her cheeks that reminded Bradley painfully of his own daughter's face during thunderstorms. "That's a beautiful name, Lyra," Bradley said, gesturing for his squad to position themselves around the support beam. "We're going to lift this heavy piece off you, but I need you to stay very still, okay?" As his soldiers worked to free the child, Bradley found himself remembering another little girl, another rescue attempt, and the bombing raid that had ended his previous life as a father. Emma had been the same age as this Zephyrian child when the war began, full of questions about why people from different planets couldn't just be friends. "Sarge," Torres called out, "we've got incoming Zephyrian fighters, ETA approximately 8 minutes. Bradley looked at the child trapped beneath the beam, then at the gas readings on his scanner. 8 minutes wasn't enough time to free her safely and evacuate before the fighters arrived. 8 minutes was just enough time to be caught helping enemy civilians, which would be interpreted as either espionage or kidnapping depending on which side's propaganda machine got to the story first. "Keep working," Bradley ordered his squad. "We don't leave kids behind, regardless of species. Sarge, if those fighters think we're responsible for the crash." Torres began. "Then we explain the situation and hope Zephyrian pilots are more reasonable than their politicians," Bradley said, though he suspected they were all about to become casualties of misunderstanding and bad timing. The support beam shifted as his squad coordinated their lifting effort, and Lyra cried out in pain as feeling returned to her legs. Bradley crawled into the gap they'd created, wrapping his arms around the child to pull her to safety just as his tactical display lit up with proximity warnings. "Fighters incoming, 30 seconds. Torres shouted. Bradley looked down at Lyra, who was clinging to his armor with the desperate strength of someone who'd learned that adults could disappear without warning. Her amber eyes reflected trust that he wasn't sure he deserved, given that his people had been killing hers for 3 years. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said, though he wasn't sure which of them he was trying to convince. "Everything's going to be okay." The first plasma blast hit 20 meters from their position, turning crystalline debris into molten glass and announcing that the Zephyrian fighters had decided the human patrol was responsible for whatever had happened to the transport. Bradley's tactical training told him to take cover and return fire. His instincts as a former father told him to shield the child in his arms. Torres, defensive positions. Bradley shouted, curling his body around Lyra as more plasma fire rained down around them. Try to signal that we're conducting a rescue operation. How exactly do we signal that in the middle of a firefight? Torres called back, diving behind a piece of wreckage that had probably been someone's luggage. Get creative. Bradley replied, though he was beginning to suspect that creativity would be insufficient for their current situation. The plasma fire intensified, and Bradley felt the familiar burn of energy weapons hitting his armor's defensive systems. His suit could absorb a significant amount of punishment, but not indefinitely, and certainly not while protecting someone else who lacked any armor at all. Lyra whimpered against his chest as explosions lit up the crash site around them. "Tom Soldier," she said in carefully pronounced standard, "are they going to hurt us?" "Not if I can help it," Bradley said, though his armor's warning systems were painting an increasingly grim picture of their tactical situation. The plasma fire stopped suddenly, replaced by the distinctive sound of Zephyrian atmospheric engines as ground forces arrived to assess the situation. Bradley heard voices in the musical language he couldn't understand without his translator, followed by what sounded like heated discussion among the newcomers. "Human soldiers," came a voice in accented standard, "release the child and surrender immediately." Bradley looked down at Lyra, who was still clinging to his armor with the determination of someone who had found safety and wasn't willing to let go. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said quietly. "Your people are here now. You're safe." But when he tried to lift her away from him, she only held tighter, saying something in rapid Zephyrian that made the approaching soldiers pause in their advance. Bradley's translator caught fragments, "Saved me from the burning metal." And, "Kind like stories say." And most clearly, "Please don't hurt Tom Soldier." The conversation among the Zephyrian ground forces became more animated, and Bradley caught enough words through his translator to understand that they were debating whether humans were capable of genuine rescue behavior or if this was some elaborate deception. "I'm going to stand up slowly," Bradley announced to the Zephyrian soldiers, his hands visible as he rose to his feet with Lyra still in his arms. "The child is injured but stable. She needs medical attention." The lead Zephyrian soldier, whose elaborate armor suggested rank and authority, approached with weapons lowered but ready. When he spoke, his standard was precise and careful. "Human soldier, explain your presence at this crash site." "We responded to an emergency beacon," Bradley said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the plasma burns across his armor and the child clinging to his neck. "We found survivors trapped in the wreckage and attempted a rescue operation." "You expect us to believe that human military personnel risked their lives to save Zephyrian civilians?" Bradley looked around at his squad, who were emerging from cover with their hands raised and their weapons secured. Then he looked down at Lyra, whose bioluminescent skin was gradually returning to normal coloration as her fear subsided. "Ask her," Bradley said simply. "Ask the child what happened." The Zephyrian officer spoke to Lyra in their musical language, and her response was immediate and animated. Bradley couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, the earnest explanation of a child who wanted adults to understand something important. When she finished speaking, the Zephyrian soldiers looked at Bradley with expressions he couldn't interpret. The officer holstered his weapon entirely and stepped closer, studying the human sergeant with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. "The princess says you protected her from the fire and the falling metal," the officer said slowly. "She says you sang to her when she was afraid." Bradley felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I hummed a little. It's something I used to do for my daughter." "Your daughter?" "She died in the bombing of New Geneva," Bradley said quietly. 3 years ago, when this war started." The Zephyrian officer was silent for a long moment, then spoke into his communication device in rapid, musical phrases that Bradley's translator couldn't parse. When he finished, he looked back at the human sergeant with an expression that might have been respect. "Sergeant Bradley," the officer said, "I am Commander Theron of the Royal Guard. You and your squad will accompany us to the medical facility where the princess can receive proper treatment. You will remain as honored guests until this situation can be properly evaluated." "Understood, Commander," Bradley said, though he suspected that honored guests was diplomatic language for prisoners with good intentions. As they prepared to leave the crash site, Lyra looked up at Bradley with solemn amber eyes and said in careful standard, "Will you stay with me, Tom Soldier? Until my mother comes?" Bradley looked at Commander Theron, who nodded slowly. "I'll stay as long as they let me, sweetheart." What he didn't know, as they boarded the Zephyrian transport that would take them to the capital, was that Lyra's mother was Queen Asteria herself, and that his simple act of protecting a frightened child was about to change the course of an interstellar war. The Zephyrian medical facility reminded Bradley of a greenhouse designed by someone who'd studied both advanced medicine and artistic sculpture, then decided that healing environments should inspire as well as cure. Crystalline walls filtered natural sunlight into therapeutic spectrums while bioluminescent plants provided both air purification and gentle, calming illumination. Princess Lyra sat on what appeared to be a medical bed grown from living coral, her legs elevated while Zephyrian healers worked to repair the damage from her entrapment. Despite the advanced medical equipment surrounding her, she refused to let go of Bradley's hand, her small fingers intertwined with his armored gloves as if he were the only stable point in a universe that had suddenly become unreliable. "The bone fractures are minor," reported the chief healer, an elderly Zephyrian whose skin glowed with the soft green light Bradley's briefings had associated with their medical caste. "But the atmospheric contamination will require several hours of treatment to fully clear from her system." Bradley watched the medical procedures with the fascination of someone whose previous experience with alien medicine had been limited to combat first aid and cautionary briefings about incompatible pharmaceuticals. The Zephyrian healing technique seemed to involve as much energy manipulation as traditional medicine, with the healers using some form of bioresonance to encourage cellular repair. "Tom Soldier," Lyra said, tugging on his hand to get his attention. "Are you hurt? Your armor has black marks." Bradley looked down at the plasma burns across his chest and arms, damage from the fighters who'd assumed he was an enemy combatant. "Just scratches, sweetheart. Nothing that won't heal." The chief healer paused in his work to examine Bradley with the clinical interest of someone discovering an unexpected medical curiosity. "Sergeant, human physiology is quite different from ours, but those energy burns appear to be causing significant tissue damage. You should receive treatment." "I'm fine," Bradley said automatically, though the burns were becoming increasingly painful as his adrenaline faded. "My people have different healing protocols." Stubborn like a rock beast, Lyra said with the serious tone children used when making important observations about adult behavior. "Mother says rock beasts won't ask for help even when they're caught in trap vines." Despite everything, the diplomatic crisis, the potential charges he'd face for unauthorized contact with enemy civilians, the plasma burns that felt like someone had branded him with molten metal, Bradley found himself smiling. "Your mother sounds very wise." "She is the wisest queen in the galaxy," Lyra said with the absolute certainty of a child who'd never had reason to doubt her parents' capabilities. "She knows everything about everything, and she can make the crystal garden sing." The medical facility's main doors opened with a harmonic chime, and Bradley felt the temperature in the room shift as Commander Theron entered accompanied by a figure that made Bradley's tactical training scream warnings about dangerous situations becoming significantly more dangerous. Queen Asteria moved with the controlled grace of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room, her luminescent skin cycling through colors Bradley couldn't interpret but suspected indicated emotional states ranging from worry to fury. Her elongated ears were rigid with tension, and her amber eyes, so similar to her daughter's, swept the medical bay with the intensity of someone expecting to find evidence of unspeakable crimes. "Lyra," the Queen said, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated in frequencies Bradley could feel in his bones. "My heart, are you injured?" "Mother." Lyra released Bradley's hand for the first time since the rescue, reaching toward her parent with the desperate relief of a child who'd been brave for as long as possible and could finally admit to being scared. Queen Asteria moved to her daughter's bedside, her hands glowing with soft light as she performed what appeared to be both medical assessment and parental comfort. "The healers tell me you were trapped beneath debris. How did you escape?" "Tom Soldier saved me," Lyra said, immediately reaching back for Bradley's hand as if ensuring he couldn't disappear while she wasn't watching. "He crawled under the heavy metal and pulled me out, and when the fire weapons came, he made himself like a shell around me so nothing could hurt me." The Queen's gaze shifted to Bradley with an intensity that made him feel like a laboratory specimen being examined under a microscope. Her ears had shifted to deep purple, which his briefings had indicated meant suspicion and barely contained hostility. "Sergeant Bradley," Queen Asteria said, her standard precise and cold, "you are the human soldier who was found at the crash site with my daughter." "Yes, Your Majesty," Bradley replied, trying to maintain military bearing while a 7-year-old alien princess held his hand and made it impossible to salute properly. "Commander Theron's report indicates that you and your squad were conducting an unauthorized patrol in Zephyrian space when you encountered the transport crash." Bradley felt the familiar weight of military discipline warring with civilian conscience. "We responded to an emergency beacon, Your Majesty. My squad's orders were to investigate and render aid if possible." "Render aid to enemy civilians," the Queen observed, her tone suggesting this concept was as foreign to her as underwater fire breathing. "Render aid to children in danger," Bradley corrected quietly. "Your Majesty, respectfully, a kid is a kid, regardless of species." Queen Asteria's ears shifted through several colors Bradley didn't recognize before settling on what might have been surprise. "You risked your lives and your military careers to rescue Zephyrian civilians." "We risked our lives to help people who needed help," Bradley said. The fact that they were Zephyrian was irrelevant to the immediate problem of getting a child out from under a collapsed transport. Lyra tugged on his hand again, then looked up at her mother with the earnest expression children wore when explaining something important that adults were being slow to understand. "Mother, Tom Soldier lost his own little girl in the war. He's sad like you were sad when father went to the bright stars." The temperature in the medical bay seemed to drop several degrees, and Bradley realized that Princess Lyra had just revealed information that transformed their entire interaction. Queen Asteria's expression shifted through a complex series of emotions that his cultural briefings hadn't prepared him to interpret. "You lost a child to this conflict," the Queen said, her voice carrying new undertones that Bradley couldn't identify. "My daughter Emma," Bradley confirmed. "She was 6 when the bombing happened. Old enough to ask questions about why people from different planets couldn't be friends. And yet you saved my daughter." Bradley looked down at Lyra, who was watching the adult conversation with the intense focus of someone learning important lessons about how the universe worked. "Your Majesty, I've seen what war does to children. If I can prevent that from happening to someone else's kid, regardless of which side of the conflict they're on, then that's what I'm going to do." Queen Asteria was silent for a long moment, her skin cycling through colors that seemed to indicate complex internal processing. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that suggested she was asking questions that would determine more than just his immediate fate. "Sergeant, what do you know about Zephyrian empathic abilities?" "Basic briefing information, Your Majesty. I understand that your people can sense emotional states and intentions to some degree. Children's empathic abilities are particularly strong," the Queen said, moving closer to Bradley and her daughter. "They have not yet learned to filter or interpret what they sense, so their responses to people are based purely on the emotional reality they perceive." Bradley felt a chill that had nothing to do with the medical bay's climate control. "Your Majesty, I'm not sure I understand the implication." "The implication, Sergeant, is that my daughter's attachment to you is not based on gratitude or childish affection. She can sense your genuine care for her welfare, your grief for your own lost child, and your sincere desire to protect innocence from the horrors of war." Lyra squeezed his hand and said something in musical Zephyrian that made her mother's ears shift to soft gold. "She says you have the same heart song as her father did," Queen Asteria translated. The song of someone who loves children more than they love their own safety. Bradley felt tears threatening to overwhelm his military composure. Your Majesty, I just did what anyone would do. No, Sergeant, the Queen said softly. You did what a father would do. And that changes everything. Before Bradley could ask what she meant, alarms began sounding throughout the medical facility, and Commander Theron's communication device erupted with urgent messages in rapid Zephyrian. Your Majesty, Theron said, his skin flickering between colors that Bradley's translator couldn't interpret, the War Council is demanding your immediate return. Admiral Kane's fleet has moved to defensive positions, and both sides are interpreting the situation as potential prelude to renewed hostilities. Queen Asteria looked at her daughter, who was still holding Bradley's hand with the determination of someone who'd found something precious and wasn't willing to let go. Mother, Lyra said in careful standard, Tom Soldier can come with us, right? He promised to stay until you came, and you're here now, but I want him to stay longer. The Queen's expression suggested she was calculating variables in an equation that had suddenly become far more complex than military strategy or diplomatic protocol. Yes, my heart, she said finally. Tom Soldier will come with us. There are some people who need to meet him. The Crystalline War Council chamber had transformed from a venue for diplomatic discussion into something resembling a courtroom where the defendants faced charges of either high treason or species betrayal, depending on which side of the conflict you represented. Admiral Kane stood at rigid attention while Queen Asteria took her position on the throne that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of her heartbeat, its living crystal responding to her emotional state. Bradley entered the chamber still wearing his plasma-burned armor, his hand firmly held by Princess Lyra, who had flatly refused to be separated from him despite the protests of various royal advisors who seemed to believe that important political discussions were no place for children. His squad had been granted diplomatic immunity, pending resolution of what Commander Theron diplomatically termed the current situation, which Bradley suspected was military speak for, we have no idea what to do with humans who saved our princess. Your Majesty, Admiral Kane said, her voice carrying the strain of someone who'd spent the last 3 hours trying to prevent an interstellar incident from becoming an interstellar war, I want to personally apologize for any unauthorized. Admiral, Queen Asteria interrupted, her ears shifting to the deep crimson that Bradley now recognized as barely contained fury, your unauthorized patrol violated our territorial sovereignty during sensitive peace negotiations. The presence of human military forces near our capital could be interpreted as either reconnaissance for military action or an attempt to intimidate this council into accepting unfavorable terms. Kane's expression suggested she was calculating the diplomatic weight of various responses and finding them all inadequate. Your Majesty, Sergeant Bradley's squad responded to an emergency beacon in accordance with standard humanitarian protocols. They had no knowledge that Princess Lyra was involved in the incident. Humanitarian protocols, Queen Asteria repeated, her voice carrying skepticism that could have been measured in astronomical units. How convenient that human humanitarian instincts coincidentally led to contact with my daughter during crucial peace negotiations. Bradley felt Lyra's hand tighten in his as the adult conversation grew more heated. The child's empathic abilities were clearly picking up the tension in the room, and her amber eyes showed the kind of worry that children developed when they sensed that important adults were angry about things beyond their understanding. Your Majesty, Bradley said quietly, permission to speak. The War Council fell silent with the kind of dramatic timing that suggested the universe was enjoying the irony of a sergeant requesting permission to address an interstellar diplomatic crisis. Queen Asteria's ears shifted through several colors before settling on what Bradley hoped was curiosity rather than homicidal intent. Sergeant Bradley, the Queen said formally, you may address the Council. Bradley looked around the chamber at faces that represented two civilizations locked in a conflict that had cost both sides more than they could afford to lose. Then he looked down at Lyra, whose trust in him had somehow become the catalyst for this entire diplomatic maelstrom. Your Majesty, Admiral Kane, honored council members, Bradley began, 3 years ago, this war started because of a misunderstanding. Human mining operations accidentally destroyed something precious to the Zephyrian people. Today, my squad accidentally discovered something precious to the Zephyrian people and chose to protect it. He paused, watching Queen Asteria's expression as she processed his words. The difference between those two incidents isn't technology or military protocol or diplomatic procedure. The difference is that today, people on both sides chose to see a child in danger rather than an enemy to be suspicious of. Admiral Kane was staring at him with the expression of someone watching a subordinate either commit career suicide or perform a miracle of diplomatic intervention. "Sergeant, I'm not sure." "Admiral, respectfully, I think the important question isn't whether my squad violated territorial boundaries," Bradley continued. "The important question is whether we can build a peace based on what happened today, or whether we're going to let suspicion and fear destroy the possibility of coexistence." Queen Asteria rose from her throne, her luminescent skin cycling through colors that created patterns Bradley couldn't interpret but somehow found beautiful. "Sergeant, you speak of building peace based on a single act of compassion. But how do we know that your behavior represents genuine human nature rather than calculated performance designed to influence these negotiations?" Before Bradley could respond, Lyra released his hand and stepped forward to address her mother directly. Her small voice carried clearly through the vast chamber as she spoke in rapid, musical Zephyrian that made several council members straighten in their seats with surprise. Bradley's translator provided fragments, not pretending. "And, heart song is true. And, same sadness as when father went away." When Lyra finished speaking, she turned back to Bradley and said in careful standard, "I told them you're not acting. Your feelings are real like mine." Queen Asteria looked at her daughter with an expression that suggested the child had just said something that changed the entire framework of the discussion. "Lyra, return to your place beside Sergeant Bradley." The princess walked back to Bradley's side and immediately reclaimed his hand, looking up at him with the solemn satisfaction of someone who'd successfully defended a friend against unfair accusations. "Council members," Queen Asteria said, her voice carrying new undertones that Bradley couldn't identify, "my daughter's empathic assessment confirms that Sergeant Bradley's actions were motivated by genuine compassion rather than calculated deception." She moved down from her throne to stand directly in front of Bradley and Admiral Kane, her amber eyes studying both humans with an intensity that felt like being examined by starlight given consciousness. "For 3 years, we have fought this war based on the assumption that humans and Zephyrians are fundamentally incompatible," the Queen continued. "We have told ourselves that your species lacks the empathic capacity for genuine coexistence, while you have assumed that our species is too rigid to adapt to changing circumstances." Bradley felt the weight of history pressing down on the moment as Queen Asteria's words echoed through the crystalline chamber. Around them, council members from both species waited for a decision that would determine whether their children grew up in a universe defined by war or possibility. "Today," Queen Asteria said, her skin shifting to the soft gold that Bradley had learned indicated deep contemplation, "my daughter's life was saved by a human soldier who lost his own child to this conflict. A man who chose to protect her not because of political calculation or military advantage, but because she was a frightened child who needed help." She turned to address Admiral Kane directly. "Admiral, the peace proposal you presented this morning outlined joint colonies and shared resource management. I am prepared to accept those terms, with one modification." Kane's expression suggested she was afraid to hope. "What modification, Your Majesty?" "Sergeant Bradley will serve as the first human ambassador to the joint colonies," Queen Asteria said. "His squad will form the initial security force, and Princess Lyra will serve as cultural liaison between our species' children." Lyra bounced on her toes with excitement, still holding Bradley's hand. "Tom Soldier, does that mean we get to be friends officially?" Bradley looked around the War Council chamber, where representatives of two civilizations were watching him with expressions that ranged from hope to amazement to what might have been relief. Then he looked down at the child whose trust had somehow become the foundation for interstellar peace. "Yes, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with emotions he couldn't name. "I think it means we get to be friends officially." The sound that emerged from Princess Lyra was pure joy, a laugh that carried harmonics of delight and anticipation that seemed to resonate through the crystalline chamber like music. The adults in the room watched as she released Bradley's hand only long enough to throw her arms around his waist in a hug that transcended species barriers and political boundaries. In that moment, Queen Asteria's carefully prepared rejection of human peace overtures died on her lips, replaced by the recognition that if her daughter could trust a former enemy so completely, perhaps her people could learn to trust as well. "Admiral Kane," the Queen said formally, "I believe we have the foundation for a lasting peace between our peoples." 6 months later, the joint colonies of the Kepler 442 system bustled with the controlled chaos of two species learning to build something together rather than destroy it separately. Children who should have been taught to fear each other instead played games that required 3 different languages and at least 2 different sets of physics. Bradley stood in the observation deck of Colony Station Alpha, watching human and Zephyrian engineers work side by side on environmental restoration projects while their children attended integrated schools where curriculum included both xenobiology and empathic ethics. "Tom Soldier," came a familiar voice behind him. He turned to find Princess Lyra, now 8 years old and serving as official translator for the colony's youth council, carrying a data pad filled with what appeared to be legislative proposals written in crayon and multiple languages. "Working on important diplomatic business?" Bradley asked, settling into a chair designed to accommodate both human and Zephyrian anatomy. "The Children's Council has proposals for the adults," Lyra said seriously. "We think the grown-ups are making coexistence too complicated." Bradley reviewed the colorful documents, which included suggestions like mandatory friendship training, and shared ice cream protocols, and no fighting during story time. "These are excellent proposals," he said solemnly. "I'll make sure they reach the appropriate committees." Through the observation deck's crystal windows, the binary suns of Kepler 442 set over a landscape where two species had learned that the most important peace treaties were sometimes written not in the halls of power, but in the simple act of one person protecting another's child. And in a small garden where earth flowers grew alongside Zephyrian crystal trees, Queen Asteria and Admiral Kane worked together on expansion plans for colonies that would be home to children who would never know that their parents had once considered each other enemies.